Is it worth the risk to keep on going?
Sure, to win. I mean, that's what we've always done. The money's never been a factor. We raced when we didn't have any.
He was called the Intimidator for a reason. With 76 wins, millions in prize money, and a legacy carved into the asphalt of Daytona, Dale Earnhardt Sr. was more than just a driver. He was a symbol of fearless control, unshakable grit, and Southern motorsport royalty. But on February 18, 2001, all of that ended in a single, jarring moment. What looked like just another bump in the final lap turned out to be the crash that silenced a legend and shook NASCAR to its core. What followed was heartbreaking. The final lap. What really happened at Daytona? He had been here before. Same track, same roar of the crowd, same tight turns at terrifying speed. Daytona was Dale Earnhardt's cathedral. He knew every inch of its high banks and long straights. He had dominated it, bled on it, and raised trophies above its finish line. And on that February afternoon, he was not leading the race, but he was doing something just as important. He was protecting it. In the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, Dale Earnhardt Sr. was holding back the pack. His son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and his driver Michael Waltrip were up front, fighting for the win. Dale Sr. was behind them, using his car like a bodyguard, blocking, sliding, defending the inside line. It was a calculated, deliberate move. He was not just racing for himself anymore. He was playing team captain in a high-speed chess match where one mistake meant disaster. Then it happened. As they entered turn 4, with the checkered flag seconds away, Sterling Marlin's car crept into Earnhardt's rear quarter panel. It was not violent. It was the kind of contact that happened dozens of times a race. But at 150 miles per hour, even a gentle nudge can be lethal. Earnhardt's car veered down slightly, then snapped upward toward the wall. Ken Schrader's car came up beside him. The two vehicles collided, and Dale's number 3 Chevrolet slammed head first into the outside barrier. It did not look catastrophic. Not at first. The car hit the wall and skidded to a stop. There was no fire, no dramatic spin, no explosion of parts. It was a crash, but nothing that would make fans in the stands gasp in horror. If anything, it looked survivable. The kind of wreck Dale had walked away from 100 times before. But this time was different. Ken Schrader was the first person to reach him. He climbed out of his own wrecked vehicle and rushed to the driver's side of the number 3 car. What he saw made him back away almost immediately. His face changed. His posture dropped. He later told reporters he would not describe what he had seen. Not because he wanted to protect Dale, but because he knew he had just looked at death. Medical crews arrived quickly. They pulled Earnhardt from the wreckage and rushed him to Halifax Medical Center. The world waited. Fans stood in silence. Pit crews stopped moving. Broadcasters, usually talkative and excited at race's end, spoke in hushed tones. They did not know it yet, but NASCAR had just changed forever. At 5:16 p.m., doctors confirmed what many already feared. Dale Earnhardt Sr. was dead, slain instantly by the impact. The man who had seemed indestructible, who had built his reputation on intimidation and daring, was gone. But how? How could such a minor-looking crash slay the most experienced driver on the track? That is what the autopsy would reveal, and what it uncovered left fans in shock. The autopsy report, released by the Volusia County Medical Examiner, confirmed that Earnhardt died of a basilar skull fracture. This type of injury is a severe break at the base of the skull, often involving the area around the brainstem. It is among the most lethal types of head trauma and is typically caused by sudden, violent deceleration, exactly what happened when Earnhardt's car hit the wall at high speed. The crash itself lasted mere seconds, but the forces involved were enormous. The fracture was described as a ring fracture, circling the base of the skull. This kind of injury causes instantaneous loss of brain function. In layman's terms, Dale Earnhardt died the moment his head whipped forward and then violently snapped back during the impact. It was fast, silent, final. There was no pain, no awareness, just sudden, irreversible stillness. Additional findings from the autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the chest, fractured ribs, a broken left ankle, and abrasions from the seatbelt. There were rumors that the seatbelt had failed, which circulated quickly in the immediate aftermath. Some speculated it had been altered before the race, others believed it had torn on impact. But those rumors were disputed by medical personnel and team members. Tommy Probst, a rescue worker who tried to save Earnhardt's life, publicly stated that the seatbelt remained intact when he arrived at the scene. Regardless, the result was the same. The head trauma alone was sufficient to be fatal. The lack of a head and neck support device, the Hans device, played a significant role. At the time, the device was not mandatory in NASCAR, and Earnhardt had refused to wear one, believing it limited his mobility. Other drivers shared his opinion. That changed overnight. NASCAR began an internal review almost immediately. Within days, the organization was examining crash footage, inspecting car components, and consulting medical experts to understand exactly how one of the sport's greatest legends had died in what looked like a survivable crash. What they found was damning. The cars were too rigid. The walls were too hard. The safety gear was outdated. It was a brutal awakening for a sport that had prioritized speed and spectacle for decades. Earnhardt's death made one thing painfully clear. Something had to change. And it did. New safety standards were introduced within the year. The Hans device became mandatory. Car interiors were redesigned to improve energy absorption. Crash walls were rebuilt using safer barriers, steel and foam energy reduction panels that absorbed kinetic force and reduced blunt impact trauma. Cockpits were reinforced. Helmets evolved. Even the seats were upgraded to cradle the driver's head and shoulders more securely. Dale Earnhardt's death did not just mark the end of an era. It sparked the beginning of a revolution. And while nothing could bring him back, every driver who has walked away from a crash since owes a debt to the legacy he left behind, not just on the track, but in the pages of an autopsy report that rewrote the rulebook. As news of his passing spread, tributes poured in from around the globe. Fans wept openly at Daytona. Fellow racers wore black armbands. His iconic number 3 car became a symbol of loss and respect. There were no more questions about his toughness, no more doubts about his commitment. The man who once said he would rather die in a race car than fade away quietly had done exactly that. And in doing so, he left behind a blueprint that might just have saved hundreds of lives since. But for those who were there that day, especially his son, Dale Earnhardt Sr., the pain was not philosophical. It was personal. Watching your father die in front of you at 200 miles per hour is not something you ever forget. For Junior, the grief turned into motivation. He carried the Earnhardt name into a new generation of racing, winning races, earning the title of most popular driver year after year, and advocating for safer racing conditions along the way. There is something haunting about the way Dale Earnhardt died, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet, sudden, almost invisible to the untrained eye. No smoke, no flames, just a man who had been through everything the sport could throw at him, undone by a single perfect storm of physics and fate. And maybe that is why the world remembers it so clearly, because if it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. How one death reshaped an entire sport. The moment Dale Earnhardt Sr.'s death was confirmed, something shifted in the culture of NASCAR. It was not just mourning. It was reckoning. For decades, the sport had walked a razor-thin line between thrilling spectacle and mortal danger. Accidents were expected. Crashes were part of the entertainment. But the death of the Intimidator was different. It was not just the loss of a legend. It was a call to arms. Within hours, NASCAR executives launched a full internal investigation. Every frame of race footage was re-watched. Every mechanical component of Earnhardt's No. 3 Chevrolet was examined. Medical records, car telemetry, even seatbelt fragments were scrutinized. Nothing was off-limits. There was a growing realization that if Earnhardt could die in what appeared to be a moderate crash, then something fundamental was broken, and that something had to be fixed. What they found was unsettling. The cars had evolved to become faster, stiffer, and more aerodynamic. But in doing so, they had become more dangerous in a crash. The same rigidity that made a car cut through air also made it transfer more force to the driver in an impact. It was like being inside a missile made of steel and fiberglass. Then there were the walls. Concrete, unforgiving, and everywhere. When a driver hit them, all the force was reflected inward. The track at Daytona was designed for speed, not for survival. Earnhardt hit Turn 4's outside wall at an angle that funneled every ounce of kinetic energy straight into the cockpit. That energy had nowhere to go, and the result was fatal. The response was immediate. NASCAR formed the Research and Development Center, a dedicated facility whose sole purpose was to improve driver safety. They began consulting with biomechanical engineers, trauma surgeons, and crash specialists. Racing could no longer afford to treat injuries as unfortunate side effects. Prevention had to become a priority. The first breakthrough was in restraint systems. Within months, the HONS device was no longer optional. This head and neck support system anchored the driver's helmet to the shoulders, preventing the deadly whiplash that caused Earnhardt's skull fracture. The very motion that slain him would now be physically impossible for future drivers wearing the device. Then came the safer barrier. The steel and foam energy reduction system replaced bare concrete walls with layered materials that absorbed and dispersed energy. Developed by engineers at the University of Nebraska, these barriers acted like shock absorbers, reducing crash forces by up to 70%. They were first installed at Indianapolis, then quickly spread across every major NASCAR venue. The cars themselves underwent radical change. The car of tomorrow, introduced in 2007, featured a wider frame, reinforced roof, and energy-absorbing materials in the cockpit. The driver was repositioned further from the door to reduce the risk of side impact trauma. Roof flaps were redesigned. Roll cages were upgraded. Every inch of the vehicle was reimagined with one question in mind: how do we keep the next Dale Earnhardt from dying? Public reaction was mixed. Longtime fans feared the sport would become over-regulated, too sanitized, too slow. Some even accused NASCAR of exploiting Earnhardt's death to justify commercial redesigns. But most understood what was at stake. The loss of one of the greatest drivers of all time could not be for nothing. If Dale Earnhardt had to die, then the least the sport could do was learn from it. Drivers embraced the changes, some reluctantly at first. Many had resisted the HONS device, complaining it was uncomfortable or restrictive. But after seeing what happened on that February afternoon, resistance vanished. No one wanted to be the next autopsy report. Crew chiefs, engineers, and even pit crews began training differently. Safety drills became standard. Crash simulations were analyzed in detail. The era of flying by instinct was over. Data was now king, and Earnhardt, though gone, was everywhere. His face remained on merchandise. His name echoed in tributes. His number 3 became sacred. But more than that, his death became the reference point for every safety decision made thereafter. Every new helmet, every revised protocol, every softened barrier carried a piece of his legacy. In the years that followed, something extraordinary happened. The fatality rate in NASCAR dropped to 0. Not one driver has died in a major NASCAR event since that day in 2001. There have been horrific crashes, airborne flips, cars that split in half and burned to the ground. But the drivers walked away, bruised, shaken, but alive. And every single time, someone mentions Dale. To this day, when fans talk about the modern era of NASCAR safety, they do not start with the rulebook. They start with a single name, a single number, a single crash on the final lap of the Daytona 500. Because that was the day NASCAR woke up, and it never fell asleep again. The autopsy report, what they found inside the car. The crash was seen by millions, but the truth about what happened to Dale Earnhardt Sr. was sealed inside the wreckage, inside his body, and inside the silence of those who were first on the scene. For weeks, the public wanted answers. Not rumors, not speculation, real answers. And the autopsy delivered them. But those answers were not just clinical. They were devastating. The official autopsy was performed at the Volusia County Medical Examiner's office, not far from Daytona. The findings were clear and swift. Dale Earnhardt died instantly from a fatal basilar skull fracture, the kind of injury that almost no one survives. What the report described was not a freak accident. It was a perfect storm of mechanical physics and human vulnerability. The ring fracture at the base of his skull occurred the moment his head violently snapped forward, then backward after the impact with the wall. There was no helmet or seat that could stop that without a head restraint device. And Earnhardt was not wearing one. But the skull was not the only injury. The autopsy revealed broken ribs, a fractured sternum, a left ankle fracture, and severe chest trauma caused by the 5-point harness. The seat belt itself came under intense scrutiny. Some thought it had been cut. Others claimed it broke on impact. Photos seemed to show a tear. Theories ran wild. NASCAR launched an internal investigation into the belt's integrity. They interviewed safety engineers, reviewed manufacturing specs, and analyzed similar crashes. Tommy Probst, who attempted to resuscitate Dale on the track, stood by what he saw. The belt was secure. But others, including Richard Childress racing team members, said the belt had sheared clean through. It was a mystery that added to the pain. Even the position of Earnhardt's seat came into question. Some speculated it was mounted too low, too reclined. Was it a comfort choice? A visibility preference? Or a mistake that made a lethal injury more likely? The investigation could not say definitively, but it raised an uncomfortable truth. Even the smallest detail can decide the difference between survival and tragedy. The autopsy also answered a question that had haunted fans. Did he suffer? The answer was no. Dale Earnhardt was likely unconscious the instant his skull fractured. Death followed immediately. There was no pain, no struggle, just silence. And maybe that made it worse. Because the man who had survived fiery crashes, flipped cars, and broken bones, the one who had stared down death more than once, was taken in a heartbeat by something invisible. There were no flames, no impact sparks, no warning, just a twitch of bad physics at the wrong time. But if you think the report gave NASCAR closure, you would be wrong. It did the opposite. It opened doors. It demanded reform. and it sparked a quiet war inside the sport, a war between tradition and survival. Because the question was no longer how Dale Earnhardt died. It was how many more would die if nothing changed. The fallout from the autopsy report was immediate. NASCAR was already reeling from the public grief, but now it had to face a hard truth. The old systems, the old thinking, it was not enough anymore. Safety in racing could no longer be reactive. It had to be proactive. That meant more than redesigning cars. It meant changing culture. For years, many drivers had resisted safety innovations. The Hans device, introduced in the 1990s, was mocked by some in the paddock. Drivers felt it restricted their ability to turn their heads. Others said it made them feel claustrophobic in the cockpit. Dale Earnhardt himself was one of its most vocal critics. He believed racing was supposed to be dangerous, that safety innovations should not come at the cost of performance or freedom. That belief was shattered the moment the autopsy findings were made public. Within weeks, top drivers began wearing the Hans device in every race. Within a year, it was mandatory. It is not hard to trace that shift directly to the sight of Dale Earnhardt's black No. 3 car hitting the wall, and to the cold, clinical conclusions of the medical report that followed. NASCAR also released a detailed investigation called the Earnhardt Report, a 300-page document filled with crash data, forensic analysis, seatbelt tests, and high-speed footage from every angle. It confirmed that the forces involved in the crash were well within the threshold of survivability if the right safety equipment had been in place. The skull fracture could have been prevented. That realization stunned everyone. Because if Dale Earnhardt could die in a crash that looked so routine, it meant no one was safe. Every racer on the grid suddenly saw themselves in that cockpit, and every team owner started wondering if their cars might become the next national headline. The report led to the development of what became known as the Car of Tomorrow, a safer, more stable, more crash-resistant design that NASCAR introduced in 2007. But even before that, smaller changes began to appear. Seat mounting angles, cockpit padding, crash data recorders, new regulations about how harnesses should be worn and maintained, and most importantly, the development of safer barriers at all tracks. And yet, as the industry evolved, the conspiracy theories refused to die. Some fans claimed the autopsy report had been altered. Others believed NASCAR had covered up certain elements to protect itself from liability. There were even suggestions that Earnhardt had already suffered a neck injury prior to the race that made him more vulnerable. None of these claims were ever supported by evidence, but they spoke to the deep emotional impact of the loss. People did not just want closure. They wanted answers. And sometimes, the truth that a seatbelt tore, or a helmet was not enough felt too simple, too cruel. In the years since, the autopsy has been revisited countless times. Every anniversary, every big crash, every close call brings it back into public conversation. Medical professionals have praised the transparency with which NASCAR addressed the findings. Safety experts continue to use Earnhardt's crash as a teaching tool, and current drivers credit that moment with saving their lives. The black box data from Dale's car showed something chilling. He never had time to react. His steering wheel barely moved. His feet never touched the brake. The crash was over before he even knew it was happening, and perhaps that is why it haunts so many to this day. Because for all the skill in the world, for all the experience, for all the bravado that made him the Intimidator, Dale Earnhardt was not immune to physics. He was human. He was mortal, and the crash did not care about his legacy. But the world did. And what followed turned one final impact into a lifetime of lessons. Even as the shock began to fade, the reality remained. NASCAR had to rebuild trust, not only with drivers but with the fans. Transparency became essential. The governing body began releasing more data after serious crashes, explaining the mechanical forces at play and the protective measures that helped drivers survive. These changes were not about publicity. They were about education. Dale's death also opened a dialogue with other racing series around the world. Formula One, IndyCar, and even the World Endurance Championship began exchanging safety research more openly with NASCAR than ever before. What ended Dale Earnhardt could end anyone, regardless of the badge on the front of the car. And so, motorsport began to move forward as a collective, not as isolated kingdoms. One overlooked aspect of the autopsy fallout was the mental health of drivers. For years, drivers had been trained to suppress fear, to act invincible, to never show weakness. But in the aftermath of Earnhardt's death, the paddock changed. Drivers began to speak more openly about risk, about the fear of leaving families behind, about the pressure to keep racing after witnessing tragedy up close. Counseling was offered to teams. Grief support was extended to the Earnhardt family and others affected by the event. NASCAR had always been a family-driven sport. Now it was becoming a sport that acknowledged the emotional cost of what it asked its athletes to endure. And then there was the fan base. For millions, Dale Earnhardt was more than a driver. He was a symbol of toughness, pride, and no-nonsense determination. His death felt personal, like losing a friend you had never met. That kind of loss did not disappear overnight, but it did evolve. Fans began to channel their grief into action. Safety petitions circulated. Online forums buzzed with technical discussions about how future deaths could be prevented. For perhaps the first time in NASCAR history, safety became a public conversation. The black number 3 on a